Good morning and welcome. We are going to wait 2 or 3 minutes for some of our additional guests to arrive. And then my teammate and global chair of Dentons energy sector and my co-chair with the Dentons Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank, Emma Hand, is going to give us a welcome and kick us off. So we found we normally have a lot of people roll in the next 2 or 3 minutes. So with your indulgence, we'll start then.
Good morning, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. It is wonderful to have you all here this morning. I'm Emma Hand, co-chair of the Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank and one of the global co-chairs of the Dentons Energy Practice, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce this panel to you this morning. We have a very exciting global town hall today to discuss the pathway to sustainability and efforts being made all around the world. Our panel this morning brings to the table a wide array of expertise and insight from all over the globe. Many of them are known to you already, and if I tried to even just read off all of the honors and awards they have all collectively earned, it would take up most of our time this morning. So I'm just going to highlight a few key points for each of them and encourage you to take a peek at their bios. They're an incredibly impressive group. First, we have Lawrence Jones, the Vice President for International Programs of the Edison Electric Institute. He leads EEI's member companies in their operations in over 90 countries and has launched several new strategic initiatives, including the Global Electricity Forum, the Africa Utility Power Sector Exchange, the Global Executive Leader Network, and the Thomas Edison International Utility Executive Fellowship Program. He also serves on advisory boards of several organizations doing important work on sustainability around the world, including the Global Board of the World Resources Institute, the U.S. Millennium Challenge Corporation Advisory Council, the 21st Century Power Partnerships Public-Private Leadership Forum, and as you will see, his experience and leadership roles give him tremendous insight into the leading edge initiatives being undertaken on sustainability all around the world. Next, we have Dwayne Hiley, the CEO of Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association. Tri-State provides nonprofit wholesale energy to its 42 electric cooperative utility members, serving 1.3 million consumers across 4 states. Under Dwayne's leadership, Tri-State will be providing over half of its members' energy from non-emitting resources by 2024, and will grow that to 70% by 2030 as it adds more solar and wind capacity while lowering rates to its members. Dwayne's leadership has been crucial to this success, and in addition to leading that effort as well as running Tri-State, Dwayne also serves on the Southwest Power Pool Members Committee and as co-chair of the Electric Subsector Coordinating Council, coordinating security efforts between electric utilities and the US government. So he also has deep insight into the issues we'll be discussing today. Next up on our roster is Barbara Tyron, Director of the Macro Grid Initiative for the American Council on Renewable Energy, but who many of you know well from her prior roles as Director for Washington and State Relations of the Electric Power Research Institute and as past President of the Women's Council on Energy and the Environment. She has decades of experience as the principal liaison between EPRI's executive management and Congress, the administration, national trade associations, state legislators and regulators, and the Washington policy community, and she understands energy policy developments in the US like no other. Next up, we will have Enrique Benitez, one of my fellow global energy co-chairs here at Dentons, leading our Latin America energy practice. He's a partner in our Santiago, Chile office, focusing on environment, natural resources, energy, and corporate law, and represents clients at the forefront of energy and technology developments across South America, including the historic interconnection finally linking Chile's northern and southern power grids, and he has deep insight into developments in the energy sector all across South America. And finally, we have another one of my friends and Denton partners, Thomas Schubert, who is head of our European Venture Technology Group and co-head of our European Energy Regulatory Group. Thomas is based out of our Berlin office and focuses on advising national and international companies and investors on M&A transactions, corporate reorganizations and insolvencies, as well as private equity transactions, venture capital investments, and joint ventures, with a particular focus on the energy and renewable energy sector. Thomas is well versed in policy developments, not only in Germany, but throughout Europe, and has represented companies in the implementation of innovative business models and technologies, such as blockchain technology and hydrogen. So he has a tremendous amount of experience in what is happening on the ground in Europe with respect to leading edge sustainability developments. And of course, you all know our moderator today, my co-chair in the Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank and global co-chair of the Dentons Energy Practice, the fantastic and wonderful Clint Vence.
Thank you so much, Emma, for that great welcome and such a generous introduction for everybody. We are going to launch right into what I think is going to be a fascinating global discussion. Our premise is that the world is way behind on climate change. We need dramatic action on decarbonization. But the question is, how do we catapult forward on sustainability while at the same time maintaining resilience and affordability? If we look quickly around the world, we know that China is booming, but burning too much coal. We have Europe, which has really been leading the world, I think, on climate policy, but has a major energy crunch at the moment that we have to figure out and learn from. We've got, I'm anxious to hear about innovative developments in Latin America and the Caribbean from our colleague Enrique Benitez. We have Dwayne Hiley, who will teach us about how rural America is going to move forward, and he is really leading the way with the electric cooperative movement. And we'll also have Barbara Tyron tell us how we are going to move forward, build essential interstate transmission, and get Dwayne Hiley and others the renewable energy they need to decarbonize quickly enough. So I'm going to ask Lawrence, who is an award-winning thought leader, as Emma mentioned, and a very gifted internationalist, to do the unenviable task of describing the world in about 4 or 5 minutes. So Lawrence, you're up, and please get us started.
Thank you, Quinn and Clint, and thanks again for having me. Thanks for the introduction. Clint, it's always a pleasure to be here at Denton. I think I'd first like to say that this discussion we're going to have today is occurring about 3 weeks before we go to Glasgow. And I think putting it in context, the theme for today, pathways, I would add an S to it because there's no one pathway to sustainability, is one that I think we have to consider very, very carefully as the world goes to Glasgow in terms of the expectations that are being set for Glasgow. Someone once said that if you expect a lot and you get less, you're disappointed. If you expect little and you get much, you're still disappointed. Somehow it doesn't really ring true to me in this context. But I mean, there are a couple of things I'd like to say to set the scene. Obviously, Clint mentioned the situation around the globe in terms of what's happening in China, India, and obviously we will have Thomas will talk about Europe, Australia, Japan. I think anywhere in the world you travel today, this issue of climate change is front and center. This was not the case maybe 10 years ago, but I think where we are today, there are a couple of words I like to throw out to the group for people to reflect on in terms of how we go forward. First of all, I think the 3 things defining all the pathways around the world are finance, policy, and technology. And those 3 things differ depending on where you are in the world. They also differ depending on the culture from which these policies are being developed. But I think there are some common themes, irrespective of the finance, policy, or technology pathway you choose. I think globalization is a reality. There are those who thought globalization was gone when the pandemic hit, but we're learning today, if you see what's happening in Europe, if you see what's happening in China, we're in an interconnected world. So any pathway that is created in isolation, I would argue, is bound to fail. So every pathway has to consider the global implications of their pathways. And that brings to the next thing in terms of infrastructure. Infrastructures are designed using materials, and these materials are oftentimes sourced from different parts of the world. That will continue to be the case for decades. And so the next question that comes to mind is, where do we get the materials that's necessary to move forward in terms of sustainability and decarbonization? The World Bank came out with a new report today that is talking about the need for the critical minerals to help us take action on climate change. And I think any pathway that is blind from the issues related to critical minerals is going to be sort of a taking the wrong approach, because you need to keep that in mind. The other thing I'll talk about briefly is resilience. Clint mentioned resilience. And if you see what's happening in China today, there's a flood, 2 million people being affected in China. You have climate issues hitting India as we speak. Obviously, we're still in the US where we have a hurricane season not gone away yet. So I think the issue of resilience, both climate resilience, but also resilience from systems, and by systems, I would include human systems. Part of the challenge we're facing, and Thomas can talk about it more, the crisis in Europe, oftentimes people think it's a resource crisis, but I think it's also a systemic crisis in terms of how public policies are designed. And that brings me to the issue of why resilience and long-term thinking have to go hand in hand. I think today we will all agree that there's a deficit of long-term thinking across the globe when it comes to dealing with things like sustainable development and sustainability. And it is not an easy challenge to overcome because everyone wants things today, but nobody wants to make any investments in the future. And I think our generation is literally leaving the world in a very dire state because our predecessors were very kind to us. They were good ancestors. They built the Hoover Dam. They built roads. They did the interstate highway. They put in place different mechanisms that allow us to blossom. Today, we are not doing it. Our generation is actually walking away from investing in the long term. So when I read and I discuss pathways with energy executives across the globe, what I find most interesting is the short-term thinking that seems to be prevalent across the board when it comes to how we tackle the notion of sustainability. And now I know it's not easy. We're living in a world where cycles, political cycles and other cycles, economic cycles, are judged on quarterly basis or annual basis or biannual basis. That is a recipe for failure. And I think the challenge we face going forward in terms of developing these different pathways for sustainability is one aspect that I think we oftentimes we neglect. And that is the role of the consumer or the role of customers. If you have this conversation today, we're all going to be using words like net zero. We talk about sustainability. We talk about decarbonization, urbanization. These words means nothing to the average consumer. They mean nothing to the voters. And I think the challenge you're seeing around the world, and we had this discussion with someone in Brussels earlier this week, and he said, Lawrence, the fundamental problem with you guys, pointing to me, is that you talk about things in words and use phrases that no one understands. So instead of talking about net zero, why not find another way to talk about it? Instead of talking about sustainability, is there another way to talk about it? I don't know the answer, but I think it would behoove us as a group having this conversation today to really try and go through it without using the buzzwords. Imagine having a conversation and never once using net zero, never once using sustainability, never once using resilience, but still talk about it in a way that will get the emotions of people moving. Because I think we will fail in Glasgow if the world goes to Glasgow and talks about net zero to 7 billion people when only 600 million understand what net zero is. So Clint, I hope that was a good opening. I'll leave it there. And it's good to go first because then nobody can attack you afterwards. So everybody can attack you afterwards. So I'll stop now and I look forward to the conversation going forward.
Well, that was a brilliant summary. I don't know how you did that, Lawrence, but you did cover the globe. We'll get into more detail in specific regions. If let's take a shot at speaking plain. And if you want to keep the world from burning up and having hurricanes and floods and drought and turbulent weather and extreme weather, but you also want to keep the lights on. What kind of technology do you need for things like long-term energy storage, long-duration energy storage, things like that, so that when the wind's not blowing and the sun is not shining, you can still keep the lights on and provide power?
Was that for me or for Dwayne?
If you can address that, and then
Oh, okay. I was trying to.
I've got trick questions for Dwayne.
Okay, that's a trick question. I think, I think in terms of long duration storage is definitely one thing you will need to deal with the variability of wind and other sources. I think, Clint, the issue here is diversity, right? Beyond long duration storage, I think for a while we're going to still need natural gas as part of the mix. We're going to need nuclear as part of the mix. And I think one of the things we struggle when we talk about even energy storage in homes, in neighborhoods, we need to take a portfolio approach to dealing with some of these things. And not to use a buzzword, we need to have all the tools in the toolbox on the table when we're trying to design pathways to go forward. And I think the risk we always run into is when we start picking or taking away certain things off the table. One quick example, and I'm sure Thomas will talk about Germany. Germany decided to take nuclear off the table too soon. And what is happening now is Germany took nuclear off the table, but is now using coal and other fossil fuels because of that decision. I'm not judging whether one was right or wrong. I think we should be very, very careful and resist the temptation to quickly say, get away with one technology or the other. Yes, we need long duration storage. Yes, we need carbon capture sequestration. And we also, I think, need to really focus on energy efficiency as part of this equation.
Thank you, Lawrence. And again, such a great, succinct answer. And, I'm picking up words like diversity, need for diversity of fuel supply, need for realistic expectations, and the need to have a transition rather than just an abrupt changing of policy overnight. And so very, very helpful guidance there across the board. So we're going to switch gears and come back to the US region, look at a portion of our country that is not often discussed in these types of global town halls. Take a look at rural America. Dwayne is not just the CEO of Tri-State, one of the larger G&T co-ops, but I think of him really as another thought leader who is bringing the co-op movement along on these issues with tremendous respect from his constituents. So Dwayne, tell us what your objectives are to get to 80% by clean energy by 2030, how you're going to do it. And then I'll follow up and ask you what some of your challenges are. And also, I did want to mention one other really critical point that Lawrence mentioned, and that is the need to not try to pick technologies, not try to pick winners, but to allow the market to really develop technologies and have an open mind as to what we need going forward. Dwayne, you're up.
All right. Thank you, Clint. Well, as I think you said earlier, Tri-State is actually a poorly named cooperative that serves in 4 states, Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico, serving 42 utility members. And if you just look at that swath of the United States, that's an area that's 200,000 square miles. It's larger than the state of California, but with a limited population, about 1.4 million people or so. And that's a particular challenge to serve in an area that's so remote and so desolate that there's lots of transmission to tie, far-flung load centers together. And we're charting our own pathway to, Lawrence, rather than sustainability, I'd say keeping the lights on in a way that we can maintain for long term. And in rural America, our members are rural Americans. We work for them, and they sit around the board table every month and ask them how we will keep their power reliable while making this energy transition. So as you said earlier, we're on the pathway. We're at 36% green energy today, adding thousands of megawatts of wind and solar to get to 50% by 2024. By the end of this decade, another couple gigawatts of wind and solar will put us at 70% clean energy across the 4-state footprint. Within the state of Colorado, we'll meet the state's stated energy goals of 80% decarbonization with respect to 2005. Now we're doing that while respecting a just transition for our formerly coal-dependent communities. We want to make sure we support those folks with reinvestment, renewables in their area, in addition to economic development efforts. And we can't do this in the West without some kind of organized market, an organized energy market to tie those resources together when we have excess amounts of the renewables that we're going to have to overbuild to squeeze out fossil fuels and get us down to that 80% decarbonization. So it's essential that we work together, not just within multiple states, but across the entire region to balance those intermittent resources against the fossil fuels we have. And as we make that transition, as Lawrence already said, we need long-term, long-duration dispatchable storage that resembles a coal stockpile, at least in performance. One of the greatest benefits of reliability is when we went through the February weather event, we could say we have a 30-day supply of coal on the ground at the plant, which can carry us through several days of cold weather when the wind isn't blowing and when we're having morning peaks before the sun rises. So we need long duration storage, not just for a few hours, not even for a day, but for multiple days. And that research we think is needed is to get us to that, whether it's hydrogen or ammonia or what technology is it that will give us that multi-day storage that will carry us as we go beyond 80% to keep sustainable, long-term, keep the lights on in a way we can maintain. So I'll try to talk that in plain language, Clint.
That was nicely done. And really, when you mentioned that you were able to get through the Winter Storm Uri and do it really in a pretty exceptional way when you look at your distant neighbors in Texas, where the entire market collapsed, almost came within 4 minutes and 37 seconds of shutting down entirely, but where 4.5 million Texans were in freezing conditions for a number of days. More than 200 people died. This is a very serious, and I think you've described the diversity of fuel supply that allowed you to have a completely different result in the 4 states you serve. What are some of the challenges for you? I know that you're moving really fast on renewables and battery storage, and I understand you need Barbara to be successful in getting you some transmission. Can you discuss that and other challenges that you face?
Absolutely. And as you said, diversity really matters. The fact that we had good old-fashioned fuel oil backup kept us off natural gas when the prices went 100 times normal, and meant that we had no rate increase when all our neighbors did. So, that's great in terms of affordability. When you talk about transmission, we really need the ability to move these renewables east and west. You look at the existing RTO's footprint or even California's footprint, CalISO, all those tend to be north and south running entities. Even Tri-State system tends to run north to south. When you think about that, the sun sets all at once on California. That's why they have a duck curve. If California ran east and west, they would not have a duck curve. And we need to develop transmission east and west to move, wind from Kansas west, to move solar from our regions in New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona, to move that solar energy east across time zones. And that will make a big difference in terms of resiliency. In other words, keeping the lights on in a way we can maintain.
Thank you, Dwayne. Terrific. We're going to switch now to Lawrence Schubert, who is in our Berlin office, as Emma mentioned, a co-chair of our global energy practice. Behind him, as a backdrop, is not the subway system of Berlin, but actually a map of all the 202 locations that Dentons serves right now. Great backdrop, Thomas. You are really in a region that we all need to learn about. What's going on there? What's your perception of what needs to be done going forward?
Yeah, thank you, Clint. And I've heard people saying that Europe is some kind of like big sandbox in terms of like energy transition. So I recall a meeting I had a couple of years ago in Texas, where I was asked what the Germans are doing with solar power right below the Arctic Circle. So that might be the outside perception. This has changed over time, of course, but still, I mean, the situation that we are having really in Europe overall is that by the European Green Deal, the main goal is really to decarbonize our economies. And this is, I mean, as you know, the European Green Deal sets out the overall EU Commission policy initiative, which was published last year, that sets out the elements for making the country carbon neutral. And we are now at the stage of implementing all this in the various European countries. But I suppose you were also kind of like looking at what we are currently facing apart from the overall change of our energy supply system, right?
Yes, exactly.
Because what we've seen over the last couple of days really is this energy crunch. I'd call it like this rise of energy prices, and mainly driven by the fact that there's a kind of like over demand of natural gas combined with a shortage of supply, which makes prices increase. The root cause for this is still under investigation by the EU Commission, and very likely there are various factors that will come into play. One of them, of course, being the unexpected high demand globally after the economy picked up after COVID, but also comparably low storage levels that we had seen in the past. And as many of you will know, Europe is heavily relying on natural gas, especially also as a kind of like transitional technology to move towards a decarbonized environment, so moving away from coal by natural gas then to renewables. And so that's hitting even stronger. If you look at Europe, the situation is such that countries are reacting very differently to the situation. So for example, Germany isn't yet very much affected by the increased prices at all, whereas France is considering tax breaks. Spain is already applying certain caps on prices for their constituents. Italy is taking a similar approach by reducing charges on the power bills, which has an overall 3 billion volume. And the Netherlands are currently considering even to reactivate their Groningen gas field, which is a large gas field that they recently abandoned. So that's the pretty diverse picture which we have. But apart from that, I think Europe will stick to the plan, which is outlined in the European Green Deal, meaning that we move towards renewables. One of the key elements really is clean energy supply coming from renewables. And it might well be that the current situation that we see at the gas market and the instability caused by that will lead to an even accelerated investment in renewables, because by building out renewable infrastructure, and especially generation capacity and necessary storage capacity, this will also lead to a kind of like independence from energy exports or imports over time.
So the Russian pipeline, gas pipeline, and the crunch or elevation in prices might actually, rather than increasing support for gas, it might actually trigger a reverse reaction throughout Europe and accelerate renewables.
That would be my personal assumption. However, it will require a couple of years really to build out the infrastructure. So it's rather a midterm goal or midterm play. But I personally think that the current situation makes it very clear that the European Green Deal has to be implemented, and this even in a more accelerated way than it was expected.
What are some of the challenges you're going to face over the next couple of years in achieving that goal?
I mean, the main challenge really is that Europe is, well, with the goal of becoming carbon neutral by
Yeah.
2050, has to change about everything. So it's not just affecting the power sector or the housing sector, but it's the entire industry that has to be decarbonized. And that's why last year, Germany first, and then followed by the EU, published their national and then the European hydrogen strategies that are aimed to establish a hydrogen economy. And to put it in very simple words, the idea is to replace hydrocarbons by hydrogen. And as there isn't yet a hydrogen, or at least not yet a green hydrogen market, this means that the whole, not just the industry itself has to move towards that direction, but the whole market has to be established, which will take a while. And I personally think this will be the highest challenge, because that movement towards green hydrogen will result in higher costs for the involved businesses that are competing on a world market with, other companies making the same products, for example, steel, but do not yet apply the green technologies. And so for the time being, there will be higher costs from certain products coming from Europe. And the biggest challenge will be how to bridge that gap and really making them not only green, but also competitive on the world market.
Thank you, Thomas. Extremely helpful. Let me just remind the audience before we move to Enrique that we have a Q&A feature on your screen, and we are saving time to have a good interactive session. So if you do have questions that you would like to ask of any of our panelists, just put that into the Q&A. Please try to resist using the chat room, because my capabilities and bandwidth are technological capability is very limited. And I have trouble bouncing back and forth from the chat room to the Q&A feature to a riveting discussion with our panelists. So please just stick to the Q&A. And
Clint, do you want us to save comments in response to Thomas and Duane until you've done Barbara and Enrique, and we can come back and respond?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's hear from Enrique and then Barbara, and it would be great to have you respond to Thomas and Duane and have the panelists interact as well.
Okay.
So Enrique is another internationalist, educated at both Harvard and the Universidad Diego Portales, and he is based in our Santiago, Chile office, but really is very knowledgeable throughout Latin America and the Caribbean on what's going on. We have a very well-integrated sector there, which I think is now in 28 offices. Is that correct, Enrique?
Yeah, that's correct.
So can you please tell us what you see happening throughout Latin America, and also what innovation you're seeing develop?
Well, Clint, thank you for the introduction. Well, Latin American countries are very worried about sustainability and resilience. That's an issue. Most of our countries already have a kind of a zero carbon strategy. 12 Latin American countries signed an agreement in the last COP25 for becoming zero carbon countries by 2050. Chile's goal, for example, is to meet that goal before that, 2040 maybe. That's something that we have to see because of this crunch energy problem that we are facing right now. We have to use once again some carbon coal-fired power plants. So it's something, it all was going very well until a few months ago, but still in America, this is a big issue. Maybe some of you already know that Latin countries are very well known as leaders in regard to renewable energy. We are quite on top of the list in this issue. Solar and wind energy have grown rapidly in these countries. In the case, and this happens because of the good natural conditions. In the case of Chile, for example, Chile has the highest radiation index in the world, and this has helped a lot for the improvement of this kind of technology. Just for you to know, non-conventional renewable energies has grown, have become an important player in what has to do with the energy matrix in Latin America. In Argentina, it's already 8%, and this year, and by 2022 will be 12%, and they were willing to become 20% of their matrix by 2020. In Chile, it's already 25%, and next year will be 30%. Uruguay is 40% already, and next year will be 50%, and so on. So just to tell you that we are worried about sustainability. This is an issue that we have some policy, we have some incentives, and all those kind of things. But still, you cannot back up all your matrix on CRE. So our countries are doing some things also in order to become sustainable. And those things are, for example, we are a very volcanic region. So there are some projects in geothermal production of energy. Chile is already investing in one project with Enel, the Italian company, and our local oil company. It's a small project, 48 megawatts, but in 10 more years should be 300 gigawatts. So it's a huge project. A lot of South American countries are also exploring in the wave energy converter, the tide energy generation. Small projects, but still they're here. And we are also thinking in a kind of hybrid projects. We have a big project in the north of Chile, which is called Valhalla, and it's a 300 megawatts solar project, which is related to a big reservoir. This energy produced by the solar project is used to pump seawater from the sea to 1,000 meters level, which is located quite near to the coast, only a few kilometers from the coast. And then they release this water to produce energy through a run-of-river generation system. So what I'm telling you is that we are worried about this. We have some policies. All the countries have now, not all, many countries have already issued their green hydrogen policies for the next years. So we are trying to bring at least. We cannot be the leaders as European or maybe the United States. We are poor countries, and that's a big issue. Lawrence said something about that. Lawrence said that, and that's an issue for us too. That at the end there are a lot of incentives, but those incentives go to the pockets of the big investors and not to the people, and that's a big issue here. We don't want to have the gilets jaunes that happened in France 4 years ago because of the increase of the price of the oil, and we have the same in Chile in October 2019 because of the increase of the ticket of the subway. So there is an issue. It's an important thing. We are investing a lot. Just you to know, last year, although the pandemic, there was a total investment for only South American countries of $18 billion in non-conventional renewable energies. And it was almost the same as 2019, and we're expecting a little bit higher for this year. So it's something that is happening. We are very worried about sustainability and also about resilience. We could talk about that later.
Well, thank you. Great overview. What do you see happening early on with respect to green hydrogen? You mentioned that it is something that a number of the countries are looking at right now.
Well, green hydrogen, how should I say? It's a big issue here. All the countries are interested. You can see, if you go into internet, you can see that yesterday the government of Bolivia issue a new legislation for giving incentives or giving a kind of a fund for this kind of project. So we are very worried about this. Now this will require a lot of investments. There are huge amounts of money that are needed for this, and there is a lot of regulations that we need. And that this is something, I think it's something that is happening in all over the world. That in order to the green hydrogen to become a reality, we need a kind of a very precise and good regulation, so that this also, but this becomes a reality, and that it benefits everyone. I mean, we have some projects already going through under construction in Latin American countries. For example, Chile is supposed to become the largest exporter of green hydrogen in the world due to its good, natural conditions for solar and wind projects. We're thinking, people are talking here that the price per kilogram of hydrogen could be lower than $1.5. So that's quite cheap in comparison to other countries. And people saying that it could also could even become closer to $1. So that's very cheap. But still, there is a lot to go. All the countries are looking forward to hydrogen. Chile, for example, is looking that hydrogen will replace our mining industry, which nowadays is 30% of our GDP. So just to know that, just to let you know what our worries are and what our thinking are in regard to energy.
What wonderful explanation. Thank you, Enrique. Now, Barbara Tyron, who heads the Macrogrid Initiative for ACOR, which is the American Council on Renewable Energy, is going to tell us how we're going to get renewables to Dwayne-Hiley at Tri-State and beyond. So Barbara, you're up.
Great. Thank you so much, Clint. I really appreciate the invitation to be part of this panel, and appreciate the comments already provided by Lawrence and Dwayne around the value of transmission. I'll amplify that a little bit and then speak more directly to your point about getting Dwayne's renewable energy resources moving east and west. So first of all, what are the benefits of a robust transmission system? Well, as alluded to by the prior speakers, it will increase the diversity of supply. It can lower the cost for the consumer, and it can increase the reliability. And when I say that, what exactly does that mean? The typical transmission line, it lasts for at least a half a century, if not longer, in the United States, which means that from a sustainability standpoint, transmission will almost certainly provide critical power supplies during a time when there's a weather event. And as we know, those extreme weather events are increasing. We also know that in extreme weather events, they're quite narrowly bounded geographically. So moving the power supply from one relatively unaffected region to an affected region can reduce the financial loss and the human suffering that we've seen occur recently. Our domestic energy resources can't be truly optimized without interregional transmission planning so that we can deliver the power to the population centers where it's needed. And power system operators confirm that having a large geographic footprint through transmission will reduce the variability in energy supply and demand. So the delivery of electricity supplies from the neighboring regions not only provide resilience, but can also mitigate the threats of moving the power from where it is available to where it is needed. And to illuminate a little bit more on Dwayne's point with his 4 states, if we look, this is a statistic, if we look at the 15 states between the Rockies and the Mississippi River, they account for 88% of the nation's wind technology potential and 56% of the solar technical potential. However, the region is only home to about 30% of the expected 2050 electric demand. So we can see that these resources, if they were able to move east and west, could provide very much needed energy to the population centers on the coast. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Is there enough authority at the federal level to handle the problem of siting in individual states and benefits not necessarily being felt in one state for the benefit of other ratepayers in other locations? What do we need to do there, and what are some of the challenges?
Well, I can say that that is a very relevant and timely question, Clint, because today is the comment deadline at FERC for the ANOPR, as they call it, on transmission, Advance Notice of Proposed Rulemaking on Transmission. So I suspect dozens of organizations will be submitting some kind of comments. I'm pleased to say that the Macrogrid Initiative will be one of those organizations, and we will be shortly submitting a statement signed by about 30 signatories talking about the importance of the future transmission system to energy and energy supplies in this country in the future. Also, as we all know, the United States Congress is considering legislation in both the budget reconciliation bill and the infrastructure bill that will help support transmission. So between what's happening in the executive branch of the federal government and the legislative branch, a number of initiatives have been proposed and are actively under consideration by both Congress, and for more to come on all of that, I'm sure.
Thank you, Barbara. Great overview. Lawrence, I'm going to give you the first opportunity to interact with questions for Thomas and other panelists. And then what we might do after that is move to a quick lightning round where I'll ask each of the panelists to just convey a few essential points in 2 or 3 sentences, and then we will move into questioning from the audience.
Thanks, Glenn. So 2 things I'd just like to mention. We didn't talk about, and it's probably my fault, we didn't talk about the UK. I think it's important to emphasize that whilst I agree with Thomas regarding the issue around natural gas, when you talk to folks in London, they will tell you that part of the resilience issue they faced there was because of workforce. In fact, still today, there are not enough drivers. There may be surplus of gas in parts of the UK, but there are no drivers to get those the fuel from the refinery, if you may, to the pumping station. And I think this brings up the issue of supply chain. And it's not just a physical supply chain, it's also the human supply chain. I think it also speaks to the issue around the public policy as it relates to workforce. Oftentimes, we expect the energy transition to be very technology focused or maybe policy focused, but it's also human focused. And I think the issue of workforce is going to become extremely important going forward. So just 2 questions for you, Thomas, regarding Germany. Is the reaction to the current crisis where there's going to still be more renewables, is it renewables irrespective of the costs, or is the cost of the energy transition going to have an impact on what happens going forward? That's my first question for you. Then I have a question for Dwayne. Dwayne, regarding the rural electrification and the need for transmission. Are you surprised that there's still opposition to transmission in the United States, given the fact that we need renewable energy, but then there are those who say they want grain, but they don't want the transmission line? Does it surprise you that there is still opposition? And then Enrique, you know, the whole hydrogen, do you think that hydrogen is now the new, I would call it the new fad, so to speak, that maybe nobody has thought about the unintended consequences of hydrogen? It looks great, it sounds great, it might be great, but you've never seen any reports talking about what are some of the downsides. And I'm concerned that as an industry, we are placing again all our hopes on one technology. Everybody is chasing the hydrogen bandwagon, when in fact, there are lots of things we haven't studied there. So any thoughts on those points from you esteemed gentlemen?
Terrific questions. Would you like to start, Thomas?
Yes, happy to, and thank you, Lawrence, for your questions, and for in particular for mentioning the cost point, because as you referred to, well, energy transition is also an emotional thing, and you need to make sure that people really and constituents follow. And the challenge that Germany had kind of was that once the build out of renewables in Germany was supported by fixed and feed-in tariffs that were by the end of the day paid by the consumer by so-called renewable energy surcharge, which by the end of the day made energy prices around 20% higher than what they would have been without renewables on the grid. And so what is currently being considered, and there were recently elections in Germany with the Greens taking a main lead. So the outcome will likely be that we will have an increased build out of renewables, because it's like clear to everyone in Germany that we need to move towards renewables because the energy demand of Germany so far heavily relies on imports of also conventional power and moving towards renewables will make us more resilient. And at the same time, the still slightly higher costs for renewables will likely be covered by or compensated by using taxes for paying off this energy surcharge, so that by the consumers will have slightly lower energy prices. At the same time, we can finance the build out of renewables. So it will be very likely will be moved over to the taxpayer, and by that indirectly the build out of renewables will be financed.
Thank you, Thomas. Enrique, would you like to discuss hydrogen?
Yes, sure. Well, I think Lawrence is right. I mean, everyone is talking about the green hydrogen as the I don't know, as going to be the energy for the future, and we don't know the negative impacts that could have. I think that's the reality, and that's what I said at the beginning, that we need, in order to develop this new technology, we need a good regulation, so that at least we try, if there are negative effects, try to limit those to the minimum as possible. And Lawrence, as you said, I think it's important. You in your opening speech, you said that we have to have diversity, and I think that's something that we have to maintain. We cannot just think of green hydrogen as a solution for everything and trust and count on that. We have to maintain a certain percentage of natural gas and other kind of fuel. Of course, it's not possible to rely only on green hydrogen. I think it's something very new. It's something that we have to think a lot about it. As Lawrence said again, you mentioned that we're not thinking too much about things like we are like firemen. We're just putting out fires all the time, and not thinking in long-term programs on long-term investments. So there is a lot to do about green hydrogen. Latin America's countries are very how do you say, very happy because of green hydrogen. Could change our economies, could change our world, and I say, okay guys, just go slower. We need to stop. I just have I participated in a webinar about 2 months ago with the Undersecretary of Energy, and I said to him that, say, good, you're thinking in doing investment right now, and in letting people coming in to investments, and we don't have regulations for all those investments. So I'm worried. I'm worried because if a client comes to me and said, okay, Enrique, I can go in all the chain of the value of the green hydrogen, I don't know. Because I don't know where you can go. I know if you can be in the storage, in the transmission. For the moment, you can be in everything. But I don't know if that will happen in 10 years. So there is also a risk for the investors. It's a risk for the consumers. The prices will rise, and that will be a big issue. So I think Lawrence is correct, and it was a good question. Can we rely on green hydrogen? I'm not sure about that.
Thank you, Enrique. Dwayne, why don't we let you respond next, and then Barbara.
Well, so I'm not surprised that people oppose transmission lines. It's like a superhighway. Nobody wants a superhighway built in their backyard, and nobody wants a power line in their backyard. But if we're going to tie all these renewables together, we're going to have more transmission. And the problem today is that states have siting authority within each separate state. I was involved in a project where a line crossed from one state into the other. One state's regulatory commission approved the line to be in one location. The other state approved the line to be in a different location, so that there was no way to get it across the state line. And after years of wrangling, the utility just gave up on the project. So if we had a federal transmission siting authority, we might be able to overcome that, where we could get the national will to build some of these desperately needed east-west transmission corridors.
Thank you, Dwayne. Barbara, I see you're nodding your head.
Well, I certainly see and appreciate Dwayne's comments about the value of transmission. And we certainly need to be thinking about this whole issue holistically. What's happening often today is an incremental approach where we replace one line with another, which is fine, but it doesn't solve the larger issue. I will take this opportunity to say that FERC has started a federal state joint task force on transmission. And as they consider this a NOPR, which will probably go on for the next year or so, I think it's wonderful that they're trying to collaborate with the states, and that the states are trying to work together with FERC so that they can help resolve some of the federal state jurisdictional issues that perhaps have impeded progress in the past.
Thank you. It is, we have an interesting system of energy federalism uh, where, you know, it made more sense when we were sort of FERC doing just wholesale states, intrastate. It becomes more complex with regional issues. And the Federal Power Act has never been completely overhauled. We've made some adjustments to it, but we really haven't looked at regional issues with the care, possibly, especially on transmission, some of the state federal conflicts that's needed. I know that Chairman Glick at Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is really focused on this issue, as Barbara mentioned, and collaborating with NARUC and state commissioners. And I wish them great success because it's such a terribly important issue. We have some time constraints for my dear friend Dwayne Hiley, who's got committed to do this with us, but notified me early on that he's got a hard stop shortly. So why don't we do our lightning round? We'll start with Dwayne and then go around to the other panelists. And then I notice we have some good questions in the Q&A room. So we'll get to that as well. And Dwayne, when you need to make a graceful exit, we will all understand.
It may be not so graceful. I dropped my laptop off the top of my desk a minute ago. If you saw the shocked look on my face, I was catching it.
Oh my. Well, can you start and just give us a couple of impactful sentences on the main message that you would like to convey to our listeners today?
Yes. So impactful, I don't know. The secret of happiness is low expectations. But I would say it's this need for the diversity in the supply and the long-term storage. When we talk about, moving away from the fossil fuels, we're losing an ability to have stored energy available on site. And so when we think about resilience or the need to keep the lights on for long periods of time, we have to think about longer term storage. We're actively exploring hydrogen. I don't know if that's going to be the cost-effective answer. Other battery technologies than lithium could be an answer that don't have to be so light and so compact as lithium ion. Flow battery, we need the ability to have on site, without supply chain delivery issues, enough energy to run a plant for many days, not just a few hours, not just 24 hours, but many days. And what we saw with Storm Uri was about 5 days. And so think about, how do we get, the equivalent of coal stockpile that has a 30-day supply? How do we get that same kind of reliability locally? And it could be big tanks of storage hydrogen or even more easily stored ammonia. It's just, we have to get there, and that may not be ready by 2030. So I think it can be ready by 2040. But between now and then, we'll be building some gas that needs the ability to convert later, maybe to hydrogen firing. So it's just kind of what I see in that transition, Clint.
Thank you. That definitely was impactful. Barbara, let's turn to you next, and then Enrique.
Sure. Thank you, Clint. Well, I'm aware that some of today's viewers may not be knowledgeable about the Macrogrid Initiative, so I'd like to share its vision statement for all. And the Macrogrid Initiative is a joint effort, as you said, Clint, with the American Council on Renewable Energy and Americans for a Clean Energy Grid. And MGI, as we call it, seeks to expand and upgrade the nation's transmission network to deliver jobs and economic development, a cleaner environment, and lower costs for consumers. And thank you very much again for the chance to be here and talk about the Macrogrid Initiative.
Absolutely. Nicely done. Enrique.
Yes. Well, if I would say, if you want to be sustainable and resilient in relation to energy, well, be prepared for changes. I think that it will be great changes for all point of view, infrastructure, costs, for the consumer, for the generator, for everyone. So if we want to become sustainable and resilient, be prepared for big changes. And another thing, also don't take decisions too quickly. Think about them, let the market move on and see what happens, like for the green hydrogen, for example. Just don't move forward too fast in intentions of green hydrogen. Be careful. And the other thing is something that also mentioned Lawrence at the beginning is no isolation. It's important not to be isolated. You have to be connected, and that's a message maybe for Latin American countries. It's something that I've been pushing on on all our offices in Latin America, saying that, okay, guys, we are the only firm that has offices in all Latin American countries, so we can do a lot of help in this issue, and we have to be connected. We have to be connected because, for example, Argentina has very high prices for energy during the day, and because of our NCRE, we have low prices during the day, and the other way around during the night. So we can connect, we can, transfer energy to other countries, and that will be my thoughts, my last thoughts. Be prepared for changes. Don't take decisions too quickly, and don't be isolated.
I think in the United States, Texas learned a very harsh lesson from being isolated from the grid and not being interconnected and able to get the benefit of resources from elsewhere in their time of need. Thank you, Enrique. Thomas, let's go to you and then Lawrence.
And well, I tend to disagree with Enrique, what you're just saying as to speed of change and green hydrogen, at least looking at it from a German perspective. No, but the key message I really want to bring across this morning is that I personally think that the current energy crisis will very likely result in a more accelerated and increased build out of renewable energy production and related storage facilities in Europe. With this regard, of course, long-term investments will be required for building a necessary infrastructure. Just to give you an example, to move towards a hydrogen economy alone, it's around 500 billion until 2030 in Europe alone. And to make this happen, governments have to provide a stable regulatory framework. They have to provide financial support where it's required, really, to kickstart new technologies, but then leave the market participants to do their investment. And if this happens and we go all in now, we can make this moonshot happen.
Thank you, Thomas. Lawrence, why don't you give us a final exclamation point on our discussion, and then we will move into a little more Q&A. And
Sure.
then Jennifer Morrissey will give some closing comments for us.
What I would say is, as we go to Glasgow, when we come back from Glasgow, I would only like to see action. I think we have so many pathways. We have so many pathways. So the pathways are there. Let's jump in the car and start driving. Some of us may drive faster than others. Some of us may run into road bumps. But I think the goal is set. The world is about to move. We need no more discussion. I think the next town hall meeting, Clint, I would recommend is about action, not about pathways anymore, because we have all the pathways. What we need now are concrete actions to go forward.
I think we should do a post-Glasgow town hall discussion and have you all back maybe a few months after Glasgow to see what the possibilities are in terms of action. Thank you, Lawrence. So let me start to look at some questions here. Our first question is anonymous. Well, it is. We have a question that appeared but is no longer in my Q&A. So Jennifer Morrissey would like to answer this question live. Do you have the question, Jen?
I hit live inadvertently. I meant to type. The question was whether or not this session will be recorded. It will be recorded, I believe, and made available as all of our think tank webinars are a few days after the event, if I'm correct about that.
Yes, that's correct. And it takes a few days for the tech people to get it in order, but it should be out within probably by the end of this week. We have a question from Sandra Bear. Here is an example definition of net zero. It refers to the balance between the amount of greenhouse gas produced and the amount removed from the atmosphere. We reach net zero when the amount we add is no more than the amount taken away. Now, what do we do with that? Lawrence, would you like to start us out?
Well, what do we do with that? I think there are two levels here. What do we do with it as an individual, as a citizen? What do we do with that as a government or as an industry? I think as a government, as industries, investments are being made to reduce the emissions in such a way that there's net zero, so that what goes in balances with what comes out. I think as a consumer, as a voter, the real challenge is, how do you measure the impact you're having on the planet? And I think one of the challenges with net zero as we go forward is measurement, variability, and also making sure that the measurements or the proclamations are accurate. And I think the accuracy of the net zero measurement is going to be a challenge going forward. So I think that's one of the challenges we're going to have here when it comes to net zero is, how do you prove that you have actually demonstrated net zero emissions if you can't really track all your emissions? What are you talking about? Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions? I think these are the issues we have to grapple with over time.
Anyone else want to respond to that? Okay, let me move on to the next question from Sharon Brown. Great information. Hi, Clint. Electric vehicles are here to stay. What can the current transmission system do to prepare for DC fast charging stations for all types of vehicles? Also, how can on-site solar for EV chargers help with this situation? Another great question from San Antonio.
I can certainly start us off on that, Clinton. Perhaps the other panelists would like to chime in. Very good point. I think one of the things that we confront with a national transmission grid with interregional ties is where to locate that. And so one of the challenges that perhaps can be overcome is to locate it close to the interstate highway system. I think Dwayne alluded to the fact that a national interstate highway system is widely accepted as something that is in our public interest. And so therefore a national electric transmission system also, I would argue, should be accepted as something that is in the public interest and perhaps could be co-located there, which would help alleviate some of the siting and permitting issues that have arisen in the past.
Thank you, Barbara. Any other comments on that one?
I'd just add that for our practical situation where it's very difficult to get new right-of-way permitted, we're going to be upgrading existing corridors to carry the additional load.
Thank you, Dwayne. And come back to question from Brian Kelly. How do you see the renewable industry, specifically solar, dealing with the moral dilemma of supply chain issues, most notably in China with the forced labor allegations balanced against the drive to decarbonization? And I see this question in other ways, for example, cobalt coming from child labor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Lawrence, do you want to get us started on that one? And there we go.
I certainly do, and I appreciate the fact that you brought up the Democratic Republic of Congo. I think the dilemma is not just the child labor law issue in China. I think the dilemma is across the board, a development versus developed country scenario. Right now, going to Glasgow, there's a big debate in what is being described as climate hypocrisy, where the developing countries are saying, hey, wait a second, you guys said we can't use natural gas in Mozambique. However, you guys are still drilling natural gas and exploring gas in Norway, you're exploring gas in the US and elsewhere. So the debate going into Glasgow is going to be a very tricky one for the developed countries, because the developing countries are saying, look, there is this idea of decarbonizing the world, but you want to do it on the backs of the poorer nations as opposed to the richer nations. Today, we know that vast majority of the solar panels are manufactured in China. We know that there's a lot of issues around, labor, child labor, and other form of labor abuses. But we also know that if we're going to make the energy transition fair and just, then places in the world where they're being told they cannot use coal going forward, they need to have an option. But today, if you take a renewable energy system and try to sell it in sub-Saharan Africa, it costs more than it would cost to bring it to the US. Now, that doesn't make sense, because if I'm a poor nation, I want clean energy, it should actually be cheaper if you're telling me I shouldn't use coal. So I think the dilemma facing the whole world, and it's going to be a big discussion in Glasgow, is how do you remove this notion of climate hypocrisy, where the rich countries want the poorer countries not to use coal, but then on the same hand, the rich countries are going to still keep using natural gas, but they're saying Mozambique cannot use natural gas. It doesn't really add up. And I think there's a big dilemma for the environmental groups who are saying, keep all the natural gas in the ground in the US, but exploit the natural gas in other countries to export it to the US. It just doesn't make sense.
Yes, it's going to be I think, a fierce backroom series of discussions in Glasgow. I hope there are some internationalists in the room to begin to address these issues. I would have hoped that we would be much farther along on these type of issues than we are right now coming into Glasgow. Other comments on that question?
Just maybe an observation from Europe, for example, with regard to lithium, where there's also this moral dilemma that we just talked about. What Europe is doing is that they are not only ramping up battery production in Europe, they're also trying to source lithium from like local mines. And so that's something which is likely mainly driven by cost factors and independence from the supply from Asia, but at the same time also addresses this moral dilemma that we talked about. So it would be some kind of like insourcing, though I'm not a big fan of reversing globalization, because there are many benefits of it. But of course, if you can't control the standards, then that's the only way how to best address this.
Thank you, Thomas. Any other questions or comments among the panelists?
Clint, can I just add something regarding supply chain that Thomas mentioned? So there's a new book out called The 6 Faces of Globalization. And one of the things the author talks about is he does an analysis of what it would cost to reshore the semiconductor industry to the US and to Europe. It will cost $50 billion to resource the semiconductor industry back to the US, and $20 billion to Europe. That excludes the whole issue around labor and the cost of labor. So I think one of the challenges we're having here is that the notion of restoring different types of activities around the clean energy transition, it has to be put in the context, what are we prepared to pay? Because if I'm going to manufacture or mine lithium in Europe, if I'm a worker, I'm going to expect to have European wages for that work, which is going to automatically cause the price to go up. So there has to be a reckoning of what do we really want? If we want us to be fair, let's do the mining in Europe, but then beware that the price of mining in Europe might be more expensive than the price of mining in other countries, not because of environmental laws, but just because of the cost of doing business in those different countries. So I think this is a very, very important point that could have some legal issues for Denton to solve going forward.
Thank you, Lawrence. Let me ask Jennifer now to help us wrap up this magnificent discussion.
Thank you, Clint. Actually, I'm disappointed to wrap it up because it's absolutely fascinating. I've enjoyed it. So I think in wrapping it up, what I wanted to just comment on is that I think we've heard a number of themes, and from those themes, a couple of key takeaways that probably are the subject matter for future discussions with either the same panelists or others. So we heard Dr. Jones lead off with sort of setting the framework, discussing what he thought of as 3 key drivers of sustainability. And he mentions finance, policy, and technology. And with that, then we all began to identify some challenges with each of these. And I think with those 3 drivers wrapped into that, we heard quite a bit of discussion about issues with pace of adoption of any policies or technologies, and issues of cost, issues of location and so forth that cause some differentiation in how different locales, different governments, different regions might approach each of these. We heard over and over and over again throughout the need for a subject near and dear to my heart, a common vocabulary, an understandable vocabulary for people to have the discussions we need to have to solve these problems. And the problem with buzzwords, we commented that not everyone understands them, only sort of the inner circle of folks understand them. But even beyond that, we broaden the discussion to include consumers and others. Even if they hear them, they quickly become desensitized to them, so they don't have the impact or the meaning that we need. We talked about net zero, and there was a great question about, all right, so we have it, and it's emissions in and emissions out, and so what does that mean? What do we do with it? Well, that's not really where we want to get. I think if we listen to the alarms that are being sounded around the globe, net zero might not be enough if we're talking about pure math. Then we also talked about the need to keep an eye on, what resources we're talking about, where they come from, what policies are implemented in different locales about it. We talked about critical minerals, natural gas in Europe, and the need for storage facilities. We talked also about the fact that we just can't ignore that we are all interconnected, and what happens in one place is going to impact in the policies and the financial instruments and the technologies in one place are going to have an impact on another region, whether it's because they don't have them, because they have something different, a different approach. We talked about the need for diversified energy portfolios or diversified resource portfolios, and heard folks cautioning against acting too quickly without really thinking through all angles of the problem we're trying to solve when we take action. And we heard about the need, we talked about it in terms of transmission, primarily the need to move resources from one locale to another, and that some of our systems may be insufficient, or there may be a need to change direction. But we also heard inklings of this in the discussion on supply chain as well. So it's not just the transmission, but it's the entire supply chain. In terms of takeaways, I think one of the key things that we heard all of our panelists discuss is the need for a long-term view. And the challenge that poses when you're dealing with policy that's often made short-term based on election cycles and so forth. We also heard, I think, particularly in combination with some of the discussion of what's happening in Europe, both the need and the benefit of having some sort of accelerator to move us where we need to be, and how this can sometimes come from an unusual place. We heard that the natural gas prices in Europe might actually act as an accelerator to move more quickly towards adoption of renewable policies and other sustainable policies. One of the reasons that struck me that that's unusual is we're talking about the need for a long-term view, but an accelerator typically is something short-term to kick it into action. And so how do you reconcile that? And then the other thing I think that's really key is sustainability goes beyond energy and climate. And we're hearing lots of discussions nowadays about ESG. And in fact, I think we have a webinar coming up soon that's going to take on ESG. So energy is a big component of it, is a big driver, but it goes beyond the natural gas. It goes beyond the fuel source to a very broad view once we start talking about labor policies or costs in different locations around the globe. And so any kind of a transition we're talking about in this drive towards sustainability has to go beyond just energy and resilience in the buzzword term that all of us on this panel understand, to a much broader conversation, that a much more holistic, I think was the word that was used, conversation. And we need to be ready for big changes. We need to be prepared to deal with unknowns, perhaps on a faster pace than we're used to dealing with. But we still have challenge that of one major or a major tension between the fact that typically government policies and the framework within which all of this has to happen moves very slowly. And yet we're talking about things that need to happen very quickly, especially if we're going to continue to try to meet deadlines 2025, 2030, 2050. How do we do that? So I think at the end of the day, the conversation has been absolutely fascinating, but I think we've been left with more questions to examine than we've actually tackled today. And I look forward to those future discussions.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think we definitely need a reprise of this global town hall. You can easily see why we call Jennifer our resident genius in the energy practice at Dentons, and she is the co-editor-in-chief of the editorial board of our think tank, and plays a number of other important leadership roles. So on behalf of Jennifer and my teammate Emma Hand, I really want to give special thanks to Lawrence and Thomas and Enrique and Barbara and Dwayne. Really a great job today. We look forward to getting you back. And Lawrence, we look forward to you explaining what the action steps are going to be in the aftermath of Glasgow. So on behalf of our audience, thank you all for just a great job today. Bye-bye.